The resources underneath the country belong to the people of the country. The resources under Australia belong to the Australians, not to the gas companies. The value of those resources, therefore, ought to be appropriated to the maximum extent possible by the Australian people.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute podcast, which explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Glenn Conley. Inequality creates insecurity. As the United States is showing the rest of the world, that insecurity can have devastating consequences for democracy.
This will truly be the golden age of America. That's what we have to have. This is a magnificent victory for the American people that will allow us to make America great again. Oh.
Yet still, governments get it wrong as they race to the bottom on corporate tax. Big gas, big tech and others are enriching themselves at the same time as governments are eroding social safety nets. But it doesn't have to be this way. This week on Follow the Money, I'm delighted to bring you a conversation with Nobel Prize-winning economist Professor Joseph Stiglitz about tax and democracy. As well as being a Nobel laureate, Professor Stiglitz is a former chief economist of the World Bank and best-selling author. He is an economist and professor at Columbia University Business School, chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD, and the chief economist at the Roosevelt Institute. Recorded as part of our Australia Institute webinar series, Australia Institute Deputy Director Ebony Bennett spoke with Professor Stiglitz and Australia Institute co-CEO Dr. Richard Dennis on the 11th of February. We pick up the conversation with Joe discussing the link between healthy democracies and collecting enough corporate tax.
Well, let me begin why taxation is important. A democracy, any society needs to, you might say, spend together. There are so many things that in the 21st century we need to do together. We have to invest in infrastructure, in education, in health and technology. It's always been true you need some investment, but the 21st century is very different from the 17th century. In the 17th century, the level of necessary public spending was very low. Today, it's very, very high. That's even more so when we start thinking about some of the other challenges that we're facing. The climate crisis, we have to protect ourselves from climate change, which is having a devastating effect in Australia and every country around the world. We're dealing with an inequality crisis. So we need resources to help those at the bottom, simply because they don't have the resources to do it by themselves. We live in a very urban society, and urban societies require more investments. Very public investments. It's very different living in isolated farms. Some places in the outback may be that way, but most of Australians live in urban areas, and most people in the world, especially in advanced countries, live in urban areas, and that requires a lot of investment. So once you realize the importance, the need, the centrality of public investment, you come to the next question, well, how do we finance it? Economics may be a complicated subject, but the core of the subject is resources are scarce. And if you're going to spend money, you have to raise the resources from it. It's really that simple. Be nice if everybody voluntarily wrote big checks, but we know that most people will want to be, at least to some extent, what we call free riders. They'd like everybody else to pay, but they would curb their own support. And that's not true in everything. People are charitable. I don't want to underestimate the importance of charity, but still, for the core investments that society needs, you need taxes. And then the third question is why corporate taxes? Well, there's an old expression, follow the money. Where is the money? And it's not at the bottom of the income distribution. I can tell you that. Uh, it's among the very, very wealthy and among the wealthy corporations. And so, one of the reasons for taxing corporations is it's where the money is. But there's another reason, and that is equity. We ask working people to give 25, 30, 35, 40% of their income in support of the state. And yet, if you look at the richest people and the richest corporations, they're not making that fair contribution to the well-being to finance our what we need as a society. That undermines social solidarity, social cohesion. It's fundamentally corrosive to our society. So I would say one of the reasons is just plain equity.
Yeah. I want to build on that, I guess, because I know you, across your incredible history as an economist, have done quite a lot of work around inequality and not only what it does to the economy, but the relationship between inequality and democracy, I guess. So does inequality harm democracy? And what's that relationship between the health of a democracy and the taxes it collects?
These are not simple relationships, but the way I like to put it is that inequality creates a fertile field for demagogues. I wrote that, for instance, in my book, The Price of Inequality in 2012, and I pointed out that there's always a very strong supply of demagogues willing to take advantage of the opportunities that inequality makes possible. We in the United States have been very, very unlucky because we wound up with, I think, one of the worst possible demagogues. Certainly, if I look across some of the demagogues in Europe, I think we've turned out to be pretty unlucky. But it was a high chance that we wind up with somebody who has no understanding of democracy and a populace, an authoritarian populace, who claims to be representing individual, ordinary Americans, but in fact, as just an example, enacted the most regressive tax bill ever.
The one big, beautiful bill to secure our borders, turbocharge our economy, and bring back the American dream. That's what's happening too. This is the largest tax cut in the history of our country. They want to give you, the Democrats want to give you the biggest tax increase in the history of our country.
This bill is what Trump economics is all about. If you are rich or a large multinational corporation, if you can make huge campaign contributions, you are entitled to massive tax breaks, and Congress will give you those tax breaks.
Just amazing, this kind of hypocrisy. It's a real danger. So the second point of this is I am very convinced that excessive inequality undermines economic performance. Again, complicated. There are examples of countries that have done well under various economic circumstances, but there's some fundamental reasons why we should expect countries marked by high levels of inequality not to work well. First, for instance, when you have a lot of people at the bottom, they aren't able to invest in themselves to get the education they need, the health they need, nutrition they need as children to become as productive members of society going forward. And so there'll be an underinvestment in children. Democracies are concerned about their children and demand that children, no matter how poor or how rich the parents, should have an opportunity to live up to their potential. And that makes for a better society. Secondly, we always talk about the virtues of competition, but having a more open society, more inclusive, means more people out there are competing, and that makes for a more dynamic economy. One of the important things that I've seen undermining economic performance is a lack of social cohesion and social solidarity. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. When societies get too unequal, you won't get that. You won't get the public investments that I mentioned before that you need for a productive economy. One of the reasons you won't get that productive investment is that the very rich worry that if you give the government enough power to make those investments that we need to be productive, they might use the same powers to redistribute income. And so they say, I'd rather enjoy what I can get today, forget about the future. I just don't want to see government having any role at all. In mistakes, this has taken a very vicious turn in development of a air Sox ideology called libertarianism. You all probably know Elon Musk and people like that. They talk about a world as if they were libertarian, but they're willing to accept hundreds of billions of dollars from the federal government. Tesla got a almost $500 million loan from the federal government that sustained it, when otherwise it probably would have gone bankrupt. So, they're all in favor of corporate welfare. They just don't want to help ordinary people.
Joe, on that, I guess I want to join a few dots there. You talked about how it's complicated, the relationship between democracy and inequality, and you just talked about competition then. Typically when we teach first year economics, we use a sort of perfect competition model to get people's sort of brains going in this direction for good or ill. And when we talk about those competitive markets, there's lots of companies competing. And we talk about market power in economics a lot. And in competition, in a competitive market, no one's got any market power. So, we don't have to worry about regulating them too much. But most economists kind of draw a line between what's happening with sort of market power and what's happening with political power. And a consequence of that is, because we assume that firms will all be small and competitive, not only won't they have much power over consumers, they won't have much power over governments. But of course, in the last 20 years, we've seen the exact opposite. We've seen incredible concentration of what we call market power. And yes, that's a problem of monopoly. And yes, that's a problem of price gouging. And, all those economic problems are there. But most people don't want to join the dots and say, well, when you've got a small number of monopolies, the rational thing is for them to cozy up to a demagogue and translate that market power into political power. So, do you want to talk a little bit about how hard it is to make good policy and good laws when so few people have accumulated not just so much market power, but so much political power with that?
So let me first begin with a little bit of modern economics and where that has really moved on from, say, Milton Friedman writing in the 1960s and 70s and shaping the kind of economics you may have learned in your college course, but that was out of date even when you learned it. The idea of very competitive labor and product, in fact, sufficiently competitive that they could it could be approximated well by a world in which no one had the power to raise prices or lower wages at all. Now, there's been an enormous amount of research in recent years on market concentration, the evidence that actually industry after industry is marked by relatively few firms. But even more telling is the research which has shown, first, that in industry after industry, and on average, firms are charging substantially above the cost of production. In other words, they have the ability to raise price above the competitive level, and they do it. And they do it massively. But the other flip side that economists had not paid much attention is what we call monopsony power, the power of firms to drive down the wages of workers. That is called, rather than the markup of prices above the competitive level, it's the markdown of wages below the competitive level, estimated in general in the United States around 30%. And you can imagine then if prices are going up and wages going down, that's an enormous amount of inequality. And it's been growing and growing and growing. Now, the point that you made, I think, is absolutely essential, that it is almost inevitable that when you have concentrations of economic power, those concentrations of economic power get translated into political power. And the reason is why this is so important is, like in any game, the rules of the game matter. And the corporations, the wealthy, know this. So, for instance, if you are a monopolist or an oligopolist like Apple or Google or Amazon, and you're engaged in really naughty behavior that you shouldn't be doing, taking advantage of the customers, stealing data or from others, or doing all kinds of things, they've been convicted of this, violating privacy. I mean, in Europe and the United States and in other countries, you're going to try to make sure the laws allow you to get away with your bad behavior. It's that simple. So you could have a law saying no accountability for scamming that goes on your platform. Well, you can make money out of scamming. The people who want to scam will give you a part of their commission on the money they make from scamming. Scamming is evidently profitable. It's socially destructive. So, Adam Smith, the far right often talks about how Adam Smith talked about the pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to well-being of society. But Adam Smith was far smarter than that. What he meant by that is that there's a force going in that direction. But if you want to make sure that force works out, he said, you have to regulate. You have to regulate them, especially in the labor market and in so many other areas where they can take advantage of consumers or others. So unless you do that, they'll get more profits and society will be worse off. There's a clear incentive for economic power to get translated into political power. One of the core issues of democracy is, how do we stop that?
You have to ask why we have this much gas we're exporting and why we're not getting our gas cheaper.
The gas cartel often tell us that there's a shortage of gas in Australia. That is simply a lie, and it's the basis that they use to make profit.
There is a lot of gas that's exported. We could turn back into the domestic market.
We're one of the biggest gas exporters in the world, and we get next to nothing for offshore LNG.
We've got a situation where the nurses of Australia pay more tax than the oil and gas companies, and so we'd also propose a 20 25% on the revenue from gas exports in Australia.
In Australia, one of the most profitable industries here is the gas industry. And, the wonderful thing about Australia, we're a very generous people. We give more than half of our gas away for free to the gas industry. We don't charge them royalties. They don't pay tax on it. Last time you were in Australia...
Why do you do
that? Well, I guess...
That seems foolish.
Well, I was going to say, last time you were here, you said it was a no-brainer for Australia, to take a leaf out of Norway's book or Saudi Arabia's book or Qatar's book and tax our gas industry. Obviously, one of the reasons we haven't is that overlap. They've turned their economic power into the political power that prevents us from doing something as simple as taxing our gas industry. You've advised developing countries around the world on development as chief economist at the World Bank. What advice would you give a poor country like Australia that doesn't know how to tax a gas industry?
Well, if you came to me when I was chief economist at the World Bank, and that was 25 years ago, I would have given you clear advice, and it's the same today. Actually, it hasn't changed. The first thing is auction off your resources for the highest value, making sure that the person willing to pay the highest value isn't going to pollute or do some other bad things, but basically get the highest value from whoever can extract your resources. Any firm would do that. And I'd begin with the premise, I think it's an important one. The resources underneath a country belong to the people of the country. The resources under Australia belong to the Australians, not to the gas companies. And the value of those resources, therefore, ought to be appropriated to the maximum extent possible by the Australian people. And the first part of that is to have a competitive auction to get the price up. Now, let's be realistic. I said before, markets are not fully competitive. Even the best of auctions does not get you the full value. There are two more provisions that are important. You have to have good contracts because corporations have really smart lawyers. That I admire them for. And their lawyers are really attuned to try to figure out how to get more of that value in the fine print of the contract from you. So you have to really look into the fine print of the contracts you design. I've seen so many bad contracts. I think that's the one thing we've learned in the last 25 years, how to design better contracts. The third thing is the point that you make. Even after the best design contracts, even after the best design auctions, there are excess profits going to the corporations. Those are really profits that, these are returns in excess of the investments that they have made to extract those resources. So, they may invest $1 billion and they deserve to get a return on that investment and $1 billion, but they may be getting $3 billion. And that difference largely belongs to the Australian people. And that's where a natural resource corporate income tax, profits tax, would come in. I would argue a very, very high tax rate on that corporate natural resource profits ought to be imposed.
I'll just very quickly follow up on that. Why do you say very high? Because it always seems like we're in a race to the bottom on tax rates. Why would you recommend a very high tax rate for resources in particular, if that's what you're saying there?
It's basically related to what we call the elasticities of demand and supply. They're making money, excess returns, off of taking Australian gas and selling it elsewhere. And they're already getting a normal return on capital. That's what I postulated. And so when I said excess returns, I mean returns in excess of the normal return on capital that they've invested.
What we would call super profits here. Yeah.
The super profits bit.
Yeah.
If you're told I can get 12% excess returns, you'll take it. If you can get 6% excess returns, that's still far better than nothing.
Yeah.
You'll take it. So the point is, firms will come in if there's any significant excess returns. And this is a lot of confusion. The corporate profits tax is not a tax on corporate capital because you deduct capital.
Yeah.
It's not a tax on labor in the corporate sector. You deduct the cost of labor. It's a tax on excess returns, super profits. And the nature of super profits is you'll be willing to do anything that gives you super profits, almost by definition.
Absolutely. And I did just want to take us back, I guess, to corporate tax cuts in particular. And I know the United States passed an enormous corporate tax cut during the first Trump presidency. What do we know about the impacts of that kind of tax cut now?
We know it didn't stimulate investment. Not a surprise. I anticipated it would not stimulate investment. It's not a tax on corporate capital investment. They were very explicit. In fact, that was a law where you could deduct 100% of your investment out of your corporate income. So they made it easy to see that that was the case. There was actually a study done in Australia by Andrew Charlton that compared the effect of, you had a provision in your corporate tax law some years ago where you have something that economists don't approve of, but occasionally gets into the law, where firms just below or above a certain number face different tax rates. And you could see then whether, if you were above the threshold, you had a higher tax rate than below that threshold. And you use that threshold to see, did it make any significant difference in investment? And the answer is pretty clear, no.
Of course, Andrew Charlton wrote a book with you, Joe, and is now a member of Parliament, a Labor member for Parramatta. Hypothetically, or not, in Australia at the moment, we're getting pressure to cut the company tax rate again. Surprisingly, the big business groups are saying we should cut tax. But Jim Chalmers, our treasurer, is actually talking about increasing taxes on capital gains. So Labor's got a comfortable majority. No one really thinks they're going to lose the next election, but how ambitious they are and what direction they go on tax is very much in play. Obviously, here at the Australia Institute, we've been saying, ignore the self-interest of business groups. The one thing you can believe is they're talking about what's good for them by their own admission. But if you wanted to give some cheap advice to either the Australian government and or the Australian people, should we be listening to the Business Council and cutting company tax rates, or should we be increasing taxes on capital gains and other forms of wealth?
I very strongly believe that you should be increasing capital gains taxes. If you don't tax capital gains at the right appropriate rate, it just simply converts income that would have been realized in one way into another way. The financial markets and the corporate sector are very clever. If there is any way they can get the return to capital in a preferred way, at a lower tax way, they can do their corporate magic, corporate financial magic, and convert one form into another. So it's like a loophole. I don't know the data for Australia, but I do know the data for the United States. Those at the top pay a lower percentage of their income in taxes than those somewhat below. And one of the reasons for that is the low taxation on on capital gains. There are a variety of ways of dealing with it. Not only should capital gains be taxed at a rate comparable to that of workers, why should somebody has a windfall of the value of land in Sydney going up pay lower taxes than a plumber who's worked for his income? I just don't get it.
Thanks so much to Joe Stiglitz for joining us this week. The latest Vantage Point essay, What We Owe the Water, It's Time for a Fossil Fuel Treaty, is available now from Australia Institute Press. You can buy this edition for $19.95. Pod listeners can use the code PODVP, that's PODVP, at checkout to get free shipping. If one edition isn't enough, you can subscribe to the Vantage Point series. For just $64.95, you'll get 4 engaging essays a year on some of the most pressing issues facing Australia and the world. Visit australiainstitute.org.au/store or follow the link in the show notes to order now. Our theme music is by Jonathan McPhee from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Glenn Conley. Thanks for listening.